I used to believe monsters hid in the dark, but the real threats arrive in broad daylight, delivered by the people who gave birth to you. When my mother sped away, leaving my 9-year-old son trembling on the porch with a heavy velvet box, I realized our family tree was rotten. Listen to how a grandmother sacrificed her own grandson to cover up a financial crime, and how I shattered her empire of lies. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. I am a 35-year-old mother, and until that afternoon, I thought I finally had my life under control. The suffocating southern heat pressed against the glass windows of our home. I was in the middle of wrapping our lives in bubble wrap and cardboard, exhausted, but filled with a quiet thrill. My husband and I were finally breaking free. Our moving truck was scheduled to arrive in exactly 48 hours. Every box I taped shut felt like a small victory against the overwhelming grip my wealthy family had on my life. I was kneeling on the hardwood floor, sealing a box of winter clothes, when the silence of the house was violently broken. It was a frail, hesitant knock, not the heavy thud of a delivery worker, nor the familiar rhythm of a friendly neighbor. It was a weak, trembling sound that barely vibrated through the solid oak door. A sudden, inexplicable knot tightened in my stomach. I dropped the tape dispenser, wiped my dusty hands on my jeans, and navigated through the maze of cardboard boxes toward the entryway. The hallway felt unusually long, the silence suddenly deafening. I turned the brass deadbolt and pulled the door open, ready to greet whoever was standing on our porch. The humid afternoon air rushed in, but the heat instantly vanished from my mind. Standing there, completely alone, was my son, Leo. He is only 9 years old, usually full of boundless energy and laughter. But the child in front of me looked entirely broken. His small shoulders convulsed with violent, breathless sobs. His face was flushed red, wet with a steady stream of tears, and his eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He was clutching a heavy black velvet box tight against his chest, his knuckles white from the strain, as if letting it go would cause the ground to swallow him whole. Before my brain could even process the image of my weeping child, the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine tore through the quiet suburban street. I jerked my head up and looked past Leo, down the street, the sleek silver luxury sedan belonging to my mother. Eleanor was speeding away. She was driving recklessly, tearing down the road with zero regard for anyone else. The tires screeched as she took a sharp turn at the end of the block. She did not tap the brakes. She did not hesitate. And she absolutely never looked back to see if the young grandson she had just abandoned on my doorstep was safe. Panic, sharp and cold, pierced my chest. I lunged forward, grabbed Leo by his slender shoulders, and pulled him inside. I slammed the heavy door shut and locked it immediately, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I dropped to my knees, right there on the entryway rug. My hands flew over him, frantically checking his arms, his legs, his face. I was terrified he was injured, searching for any physical wound or bruise. But he was physically completely intact. The damage was entirely psychological. He was hyperventilating, struggling to pull air into his lungs, shivering violently despite the oppressive summer heat leaking through the windows. "Leo, sweetie, look at me," I pleaded, pulling him into a desperate embrace. I buried my face in his hair, trying to project a calm I did not feel. "What happened? What did Grandma say to you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He clung to my shirt, his small fingers digging into the fabric. He pulled back just enough to meet my eyes, and the sheer devastation in his gaze shattered my heart. "Grandma said this box is my entire future. Mom," he sobbed, his voice cracking with every single word. "She said you are trying to burn my future to the ground." A wave of cold dread washed over me. chilling my blood. I gently pried the heavy black velvet box from his rigid grip. It felt absurdly heavy, the velvet smooth but menacing. I left Leo sitting safely on the rug and carried the box to the kitchen counter. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for the golden latch. I did not know what to expect. Given my mother's flair for dramatic cruelty, I braced myself for a mutilated family portrait, a broken heirloom, or a vicious, handwritten threat. But the truth waiting inside the plush, crimson interior was infinitely worse than anything my imagination could have conjured. It was a massive stack of banking documents. The heavy parchment pages were bound tightly together, stamped repeatedly with bold, red ink that spelled the word confidential. Resting ominously on top of the thick pile of files was a single, ornate silver key. It was heavy, antique, and entirely out of place. Tucked right beside the key was a crisp, white card of expensive stationery. It bore no greeting, no signature, and absolutely no trace of familial affection. It contained one single, aggressive sentence written in my mother's sharp handwriting. "Cancel the moving truck immediately." My breathing grew shallow as I reached out and picked up the top layer of financial records. I forced my eyes to focus on the dense columns of numbers, the routing codes, and the complex legal jargon detailing offshore accounts. Then, my eyes locked onto the primary account holder information. My heart stopped. The blood drained completely from my face. The names and the social security numbers listed alongside millions of dollars did not belong to my wealthy stepfather, Richard. They did not belong to my mother. They belonged to my 9-year-old son, Leo. In that singular, terrifying moment, the thick fog of confusion evaporated, leaving behind a horrifying clarity. My parents were not lashing out because they were heartbroken over their grandson moving away. They were not suffering from separation anxiety. They were consumed by pure, desperate terror. A massive, criminal secret was sitting in my kitchen, and they were fully prepared to sacrifice the future and the freedom of a little boy just to save their own skin. Growing up in Charleston was like living inside a beautifully crafted snow globe made of thick, bulletproof glass. It was pristine, picturesque, and utterly starved of oxygen. My mother, Eleanor, and my stepfather, Richard, were undeniable royalty within the elite circles of Southern society. Richard was a man who wielded his immense wealth not as a tool to bring comfort to his family, but as a heavy weapon designed for total submission. To the outside world, observing us from a distance, we were the flawless picture of aristocratic grace. We attended every prestigious charity gala. We smiled brightly for the glossy pages of local society magazines, and my parents hosted extravagant garden parties that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to orchestrate. But behind the towering iron gates of our sprawling, historic estate, affection was treated as a highly regulated currency. Every embrace, every word of praise, and every single dollar spent on my private education came with a suffocating, invisible string attached. Love in that house was never freely given. It was leased, and the emotional interest rates were absolutely extortionate. If you dared to deviate from their grand, meticulously planned design, the financial funding and the parental affection were instantly and ruthlessly severed. I learned at a very young age that the only possible way to survive a golden cage is to forge your own key. I absolutely refused to become just another ornamental piece in their extensive collection of status symbols. The exact day I graduated from college, I walked away from the lucrative family trusts and the guaranteed seats on corporate boards. I fought tooth and nail, working 80-hour weeks, to build my own life completely from scratch. Eventually, my relentless dedication paid off, and I climbed the aggressive corporate ranks to become the chief auditor at Aegis Horizon Financial. In the rigorous world of corporate finance, numbers simply do not lie. They do not manipulate your feelings, and they never demand your soul in exchange for a false sense of security. My career became my impenetrable fortress, built entirely on cold logic and absolute transparency. It was the exact, diametric opposite of the shadowy backroom deals and the constant emotional blackmail that defined the environment of my childhood home. My ultimate, unforgivable act of rebellion, however, was falling deeply in love with Marcus. Marcus was a gentle, deeply passionate high school history teacher. He drove a worn-out, 10-year-old sedan, he wore comfortably patched corduroy jackets, and he possessed a quiet, unshakable moral integrity that absolutely terrified my parents. He was completely immune to Richard's practiced intimidation tactics. I will never forget the day before our wedding, when Richard offered to buy us a massive, multi-million-dollar mansion as a so-called gift. Marcus looked him dead in the eye and politely declined. "Thank you, Richard, but we prefer to build a home we can actually afford on our own 2 salaries," he stated calmly. My parents despised him for that exact moment of defiance. To Richard and Eleanor, a man who could not be bought was a deeply dangerous man who could not be controlled. Marcus was the ultimate, unfixable glitch in their perfectly engineered system of dominance. For many years, we managed to maintain a cold, strictly polite distance from the estate. We lived our modest, happy life, raising our beautiful boy, while my parents continued to reign over their increasingly isolated social empire. But that fragile peace shattered completely when Marcus received a truly life-changing phone call. He was officially offered the highly coveted position of headmaster at a progressive, widely respected academy in Portland, Oregon. It was an incredible professional opportunity, located nearly 3,000 miles away from the toxic, suffocating reach of Charleston. Moving across the country meant securing our true, permanent independence. It meant raising our boy in a completely new environment, where the heavy family name held zero power or influence. We accepted the offer immediately, popping a cheap bottle of champagne in our small kitchen, completely unaware that the subtle psychological warfare had already begun. Richard did not throw a loud temper tantrum. He did not yell or make empty threats over the phone. Instead, he operated exactly like a venomous snake, striking silently from the shadows when we were looking the other way. He began making unannounced, highly calculated visits to the school district where Marcus currently worked. He would conveniently corner the district superintendent at exclusive local golf clubs, dropping carefully constructed, poisonous hints into casual conversation. He spoke in hushed, fake, sorrowful tones about Marcus supposedly drowning in massive, hidden financial debts. He actively planted insidious, highly damaging rumors that our exciting move to the West Coast was not actually a career advancement, but rather a desperate, panicked flight from impending bankruptcy and severe family disgrace. At the time, I foolishly brushed off Richard's bizarre behavior. I sat on our couch and reassured my husband. "It is just Richard throwing a final, pathetic tantrum because he can no longer control us," I told Marcus. I genuinely, truly believed. It was simply the fading echo of an arrogant, aging man obsessed with dictating every single move his family members made. I thought his desperate, underhanded attempts to sabotage my husband's spotless career were born purely out of a bruised ego and a sick, ingrained need for absolute control. I was so incredibly, dangerously naive. I had spent my entire professional life analyzing thousands of complex corporate balance sheets, expertly hunting for hidden liabilities and sophisticated fraudulent expenditures. Yet I had completely, utterly missed the massive, catastrophic fraud operating right inside my own lineage. I firmly believed his obsessive need to keep us trapped in this state was just a toxic manifestation of his empty authority. I believed that comforting lie right up until the exact second that heavy, black velvet box was unceremoniously dropped into the trembling hands of my innocent child. The house was finally dead silent. It took 3 agonizing hours to calm my terrified child down enough for him to fall into a restless, exhausted sleep. I sat beside his bed, holding his small hand until his breathing evened out, my own heart hammering a relentless, furious rhythm against my ribs. Once I was absolutely certain he was asleep, I quietly slipped out of his room, walked down the dark hallway, and carried that cursed velvet box into the living room. I pushed the half-packed moving boxes aside, clearing a large space on the rug. I dumped the thick stack of confidential banking documents onto the floor. I did not approach this as a terrified daughter or a panicked mother. I approached it as the chief auditor of a major financial institution. I systematically organized the papers, separating bank statements, corporate registry files, tax declarations, and wire transfer logs into neat, chronological piles. My professional instincts completely took over, turning my raging emotions into cold, hyper-focused concentration. The first hour of analysis felt like descending into a labyrinth of sophisticated corporate deceit. I started tracking the money flow. The documents detailed an incredibly complex web of offshore accounts located in jurisdictions notoriously hostile to federal oversight. There were massive, untraceable wire transfers bouncing from shell corporations in the Cayman Islands to holding trusts in Luxembourg, and then filtering quietly back into domestic accounts disguised as foreign investment returns. It was textbook money laundering, executed with a level of precision that made my blood run absolutely cold. The sheer volume of capital moving through these shadow channels was staggering. We were looking at tens of millions of dollars being actively concealed from the Internal Revenue Service. But the true paralyzing horror did not hit me until I cross-referenced the primary beneficiary identification codes listed on the master registry. Every single shell company, every hidden trust fund, and every heavily shielded offshore bank account shared exactly one primary domestic beneficiary. I stared at the 9-digit Social Security number printed boldly at the top of a primary holding document. I knew those 9 numbers entirely by heart. I had written them down on countless medical forms and school registration papers. It was not Richard's identification. It was not Eleanor's identification. It was the Social Security number belonging to my perfectly innocent, 9-year-old son. My vision actually blurred for a fraction of a second. The reality of what I was looking at felt like a physical blow to the chest. Richard and Eleanor had not just committed massive financial fraud, they had stolen the identity of their own flesh and blood to do it. Over the past 7 years, exactly since Leo was 2 years old, they had been systematically funneling massive amounts of illicit funds through his name. They had successfully built an invisible, criminal empire directly on the small shoulders of a toddler. I dove deeper into the corporate ledgers, reading through the financial statements with a sickening clarity. The reason behind this monstrous betrayal became blatantly obvious. My parents' supposedly invincible business empire in Charleston was nothing but a hollow, rotting shell. Their primary real estate development firm was practically bankrupt, drowning under the weight of catastrophic investments and crippling loans. To maintain their lavish lifestyle, their multi-million-dollar estate, and their iron grip on the local society, Richard had resorted to funneling massive amounts of undeclared income from illegal kickbacks and tax evasion schemes. By registering the shadow companies under a minor who obviously possessed zero taxable income and no financial history, they effectively created a ghost entity. They bypassed standard corporate audits completely, relying on the fact that the government rarely scrutinizes the complex foreign holdings of a child residing quietly in South Carolina. Suddenly, the violent desperation to stop our relocation across the country made absolute, terrifying sense. It was never about them missing us. It was never about losing control over my daily life. It was purely about the impending, catastrophic collapse of their fraudulent network. If Marcus and I moved to Portland, Oregon, we would legally establish a new state residency. As part of that standard interstate relocation process, I would have to transfer Leo's permanent address, update his health insurance, and register him in a new public school district across state lines. That simple administrative shift would automatically trigger an interstate data synchronization within the federal tax databases. The sudden, massive relocation of a minor listed as a primary beneficiary of multiple foreign trusts would immediately raise a massive, bright red flag for the federal authorities. An automated audit would be triggered within 30 to 60 days. The moment the government looked closely at Leo's Social Security number, Richard and Eleanor's entire multi-million-dollar laundering operation would instantly implode, sending both of them directly to federal prison for decades. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the ornate silver key resting on the carpet. It felt freezing cold against my skin. According to the attached authorization mandate I found at the bottom of the stack, This key belonged to a highly secure safe deposit box at a private, elite financial institution right here in downtown Charleston. The document clearly stated that this specific deposit box contained the original, physical master ledgers. Those ledgers were the holy grail of their entire operation, the indisputable proof of every single illegal transaction. But there was a massive, fatal flaw in their master plan, a flaw that forced them to drop the box on my porch. The primary holding account was structured so rigidly that keeping the deposit box active and preventing the bank from freezing the assets required the physical, notarized signature of the minor's legal guardian. They needed my signature on a renewed authorization form by the end of the week. They had masterfully shifted every ounce of legal jeopardy onto a 9-year-old boy. They deliberately manufactured a scenario where any attempt I made to leave the state would result in federal agents knocking down my door to investigate my son for international tax fraud. My own parents had wrapped a legal noose around Leo's neck, and they were using his safety as the ultimate, unbreakable chain to keep me trapped in their poisonous world forever. I sat in the dim light of the living room until 3 o'clock in the morning, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, completely consumed by a cold. Calculating rage. The tears had completely stopped. The auditor in me had found the absolute bottom line, and the mother in me was preparing to burn their entire world to ashes. The very next morning, I grabbed my cell phone, fully intending to call the authorities and expose the entire operation. I was ready to bring the police directly to my front door, but my mother had anticipated my exact reaction. She had always been 10 steps ahead in the dark game of social warfare. Before my finger could even press the dial button, my phone began vibrating frantically with a barrage of text messages from old acquaintances and distant relatives. Eleanor had already launched a massive, preemptive strike against my sanity. She had spent the entire morning calling every influential member of the Charleston elite circle, shedding flawless crocodile tears. She systematically planted a vicious, highly coordinated rumor that the stress of the upcoming interstate move had caused me to suffer a severe, catastrophic mental breakdown. She told judges, bank managers, and socialites that I was experiencing intense paranoid delusions, actively hallucinating that my own family was conspiring against me. By noon, my credibility within the city was completely and utterly annihilated. If I walked into a police precinct raving about offshore accounts and stolen identities, they would instantly view me as a tragic psychiatric case, not a credible corporate whistleblower. While Eleanor successfully assassinated my character, Richard aimed his weapon directly at the absolute heart of my marriage. That same afternoon, a heavy manila envelope arrived at the local high school where Marcus was currently teaching. It was completely anonymous, left without a single trace right on his office desk. When Marcus brought the heavy envelope home and opened it on our kitchen island, the color completely drained from his face. Inside was a thick stack of incredibly sophisticated, fabricated digital correspondence. The printed emails meticulously framed Marcus as the criminal mastermind behind the entire offshore financial scheme. The forged documents made it look entirely convincing that my husband had secretly set up the shadow funds to aggressively siphon millions of dollars from my wealthy parents, using his own stepson as the ultimate legal shield. The forgery was terrifyingly flawless. Richard had hired professionals to spoof IP addresses matching our home router, replicate Marcus's exact speech patterns, and mirror his daily work schedule to create an undeniable paper trail of guilt. The very last page in the thick envelope was a typed note bearing Richard's personal letterhead. It laid out a simple, paralyzing ultimatum. If we loaded our belongings onto that moving truck, or if we attempted to board any flight heading to Oregon, Richard would instantly hand the entire forged dossier directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. With his vast legal resources, his political connections, and my newly manufactured reputation as a paranoid, delusional woman, Marcus would absolutely lose in any court of law. My gentle, honorable husband, who had never broken a single rule in his entire life, would be permanently stripped of his teaching license and sent to a federal penitentiary for a very long time. I stood completely frozen in the center of our living room. surrounded by half-packed cardboard boxes that now felt like tombstones. Marcus was sitting heavily on the edge of the sofa, his head buried deep in his hands, completely crushed by the sheer weight of their ruthless malice. In the adjacent room, Leo was quietly playing with his brightly colored building blocks, entirely oblivious to the apocalyptic storm raging right above his head, looking at the two people I loved most in the entire world, utterly trapped by the poisonous actions of my blood relatives. The suffocating desperation suddenly evaporated from my chest. In its place, a freezing, absolute rage cascaded heavily down my spine. It was a clarifying anger, sharp and blindingly bright, burning away the last remaining shreds of familial loyalty I had foolishly held on to. For 35 years, I had allowed these people to dictate my worth. I had spent my entire adult life dodging their manipulative tactics and trying to quietly build a safe haven far away from their toxic fallout. But running away was obviously no longer a viable option. Fleeing to the West Coast would just be a temporary delay of an inevitable, fatal explosion. I realized with crystal clarity that I could not spend another single second playing the role of the terrified, submissive victim. If I cowered and surrendered now, they would own Marcus, they would own Leo, and they would own my soul forever. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cold logic of an auditor wash over the burning fury of a mother. I analyzed the board like a grandmaster facing a seemingly impossible checkmate. And then, I saw it. I saw the massive, glaring vulnerability deeply embedded in their supposedly flawless strategy. Their ultimate, fatal weakness was their own monumental arrogance. Richard and Eleanor were so totally blinded by their immense wealth and their long history of absolute dominance that they genuinely believed I was still the exact same easily manipulated, frightened little girl I was 2 decades ago. They completely underestimated the woman I had become. They forgot that I had spent the last 10 years professionally tearing apart the financial defenses of ruthless corporate giants. They thought they were playing a simple game of emotional intimidation. They did not realize they had just challenged a master auditor to a war of total, merciless destruction. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, I picked up my phone and dialed my mother's number. I had spent the entire night pacing the floor, meticulously practicing the exact pitch and tremor of a completely broken, defeated woman. When Eleanor finally answered on the 4th ring, her voice was dripping with icy, aristocratic condescension. I did not give her a single chance to speak. I immediately launched into a pathetic, breathless string of apologies. I forced hot, stinging tears to spill down my cheeks, allowing the genuine exhaustion of the past 48 hours to make my desperate sobbing sound terrifyingly real. "Mom, you win," I choked out, making sure my voice cracked pathetically. "I was so wrong. I cannot fight you and Richard anymore. Please, just make the threats against Marcus stop. We surrender." I heard a sharp, triumphant intake of breath on the other end of the line. The vicious satisfaction radiating through the phone speaker was almost palpable. I continued my humiliating performance, feeding her exactly what her massive, fragile ego demanded. I promised her that I was calling the moving company to cancel the freight truck immediately. I assured her that Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table right now, drafting his official letter of resignation to the prestigious academy in Portland, giving up his dream job. Most importantly, I swore that I would drive over to their massive estate on Monday morning and obediently sign every single financial authorization document Richard required to keep the offshore accounts active. Eleanor let out a soft, venomous chuckle. "I always knew you would finally come to your senses, my darling," she purred, the fake, dripping Southern charm returning to her voice, now that she believed she had successfully reestablished total dominance over my life. "Family is absolutely everything. To prove you are truly committed to healing this unfortunate little rift, Richard and I expect you and Marcus to attend the annual Heritage Charity Gala this Saturday evening. You will wear the dark sapphire gown I bought you last season, and we will present a united, flawless front to the entire city. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" "Yes, Mom," I whispered meekly. "We will be there." I ended the call and instantly wiped the tears from my face. My crying completely stopped in a fraction of a second, replaced by a razor-sharp, freezing focus. They thought I was thoroughly crushed. They genuinely believed their brutal extortion tactics had successfully neutralized the threat of my departure. That arrogant, fatal assumption was the exact shield I needed to execute my counterattack. At 11 o'clock that same morning, while my parents were undoubtedly celebrating their ruthless victory at their country club, I hailed a quiet cab and headed straight to the prestigious financial district in downtown Charleston. I walked into the grand marble lobby of the private bank with my head bowed, perfectly playing the role of a stressed, submissive daughter running a highly confidential errand for her powerful father. My hands were shaking, but absolutely not from fear. The pure adrenaline surging through my veins was electric. I presented the heavy silver key and the existing, unexpired authorization mandate to the head vault manager, because they had not yet forced me to sign the newly updated paperwork. My current legal access to the chamber was technically still valid. The manager led me down a heavily guarded, silent corridor and left me completely alone inside the sterile stainless steel viewing room. I slid the silver key into the lock of the designated safe deposit box and turned it with a heavy click. The thick metal door swung open. Resting alone inside the deep chamber was a massive, leather-bound master ledger. I pulled it out and flipped through the heavy parchment pages. It was all there. Every single illegal wire transfer, every hidden shell company, and every massive tax evasion scheme spanning the last 7 years. Meticulously recorded in black ink, it detailed illicit transactions worth tens of millions of dollars. It was the undeniable, physical proof that would bury them permanently. I slipped the heavy ledger into my oversized leather tote bag, locked the empty metal box, and walked confidently out of the bank with their entire criminal empire slung casually over my right shoulder. I did not go back to my house. Instead, I drove directly to the heavily fortified corporate headquarters of Aegis Horizon Financial. As the chief auditor, I had unrestricted, top-tier access to the most secure, deeply encrypted communication networks in the entire building. I locked myself inside my soundproof corner office, bypassed the standard external corporate servers, and established a direct, completely untraceable connection to a highly classified federal database. Using my professional credentials, I bypassed the local field offices completely and reached out directly to a senior investigative director at the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network in Washington. I spent the next 4 solid hours laying out the most devastating, meticulously documented whistleblowing report of my entire professional career. I scanned and uploaded every single page of the original leather-bound ledger. I provided the complete, horrific offshore account details registered under Leo's stolen Social Security number. Finally, I transmitted high-resolution copies of the sophisticated, forged blackmail emails Richard had manufactured to destroy my husband. I did not just hand the federal agents a vague suspicion. I handed them a fully assembled, airtight criminal conviction wrapped in a neat, undeniable bow. The senior federal investigator was absolutely astounded by the sheer magnitude and structural precision of the evidence I provided. When we finally concluded the secure briefing, we devised a precise, inescapable tactical plan. We would absolutely not wait for Monday morning. We would not give Richard and Eleanor a single second to realize the master ledger was missing from the vault. We decided to execute the massive sting operation at the exact moment they felt the most invincible and powerful. I was going to give my parents the flawless, highly public family reunion they had so arrogantly demanded, right under the dazzling crystal chandeliers of their precious charity gala. Everything was perfectly set for their total, spectacular ruin. Saturday evening arrived with the suffocating humidity typical of a southern summer, but inside the grand ballroom of the Heritage Country Club, the air was chilled to perfection. The annual charity gala was a dazzling, nauseating display of excessive wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over hundreds of Charleston's most elite socialites, all dripping in diamonds and sipping vintage champagne. I stood near the front of the room, encased in the heavy, dark sapphire gown my mother had forced me to wear. Marcus stood right beside me, his hand resting reassuringly on the small of my back. To the oblivious crowd around us, we looked like the picture-perfect heirs to a magnificent dynasty. At exactly 9 o'clock, the soft chatter died down as Richard confidently strode onto the massive stage. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and leaned into the polished mahogany podium. His voice boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system, dripping with manufactured humility and nauseating charm. He spent the first 10 minutes weaving a beautiful, entirely fabricated tale about the enduring strength of our family lineage. He spoke about tradition, about unwavering unity, and about the deep sacrifices we supposedly made for one another. It was a masterful, sickening performance designed to cement his absolute authority in front of his wealthy peers. And tonight, Richard announced, extending his arms toward the crowd with a benevolent smile, I want to invite my brilliant daughter and her wonderful husband onto this stage. They are the living embodiment of our family's glorious future. The crowd erupted into polite, synchronized applause, but right as I took my first step toward the velvet-carpeted stairs, the heavy double oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung shut with a resounding, echoing thud. The synchronized applause faltered and died. Several highly trained, plainclothes federal agents stepped seamlessly out of the shadows, effectively sealing off every single exit in the massive hall. They did not shout or draw their weapons, but their sudden, imposing presence dropped the temperature in the room to freezing. Richard squinted against the bright stage lights, his confident smile wavering slightly as he noticed the sudden commotion near the back. He had absolutely no idea that the net had already closed perfectly around his throat. I calmly walked up the stairs and stepped onto the stage, leaving Marcus standing safely on the floor below. I did not step up to the microphone. I did not offer a tearful speech of gratitude. Instead, I reached into the hidden folds of my dark sapphire gown and pulled out an object that made my mother, who was sitting in the front row, gasp out loud. It was a heavy black velvet box. It was an exact, identical replica of the terrifying package they had mercilessly dumped into the trembling hands of my 9-year-old son just a few days prior. I stepped right into Richard's personal space and firmly pressed the dark box directly into his chest. He reflexively grabbed it, his eyes darting frantically between my stone-cold face and the heavy object in his hands. "What on earth is this?" he hissed under his breath, his microphone barely picking up the frantic whisper. "Open it, Richard," I replied, my voice steady and loud enough for the first few rows to hear perfectly. "It is your entire future, just like you told Leo." With shaking fingers, he popped the golden latch. He expected a gift. He expected a symbol of my total submission. Instead, he found a thick stack of legal documents bearing the unmistakable seal of the United States Department of Justice. Resting right on top was a certified copy of a federal arrest warrant, issued specifically for him and my mother, accompanied by a sweeping, immediate injunction freezing every single penny of their illegal domestic and offshore assets. I watched the exact second his arrogant soul left his body. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He dropped the velvet box. The federal warrant spilled across the polished wooden stage for everyone to see. Before he could utter a single word of defense, 2 federal agents materialized on either side of him. They grabbed his arms, spun him around roughly, and the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed loudly through the completely silent ballroom. Down in the front row, the flawless, aristocratic facade Eleanor had spent 4 decades cultivating shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She leaped from her chair, screaming uncontrollably, her voice raw and hysterical. She clawed at the air as another team of agents surrounded her, reading her Miranda rights over her deafening shrieks. The hundreds of wealthy guests stared in absolute paralyzed horror as the untouchable king and queen of Charleston high society were publicly and violently ripped from their thrones. As the agents dragged Richard off the stage, I slowly walked down the steps and stopped right in front of Eleanor. She was thrashing wildly against the officers holding her arms, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She locked her terrified, furious eyes onto mine. "You did this!" she shrieked, spitting the words at me like venom. I looked down at her with absolutely zero pity. "Family is not a weapon you can exploit," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through her hysteria. "And you chose the exact wrong person to threaten." I turned my back on her for the final time. I linked my arm through Marcus's, and together, we walked straight out of the grand ballroom, leaving the chaotic, burning ruins of their criminal empire far behind us. The very next morning, exactly as the bright golden sun began to rise over the horizon, our family of 3 smiled brightly at each other. We stepped onto a direct commercial flight, heading straight to Portland, Oregon. There were no more shadow companies, no more blackmail, and no more suffocating cages. For the first time in 35 years, I was breathing completely free air, ready to finally begin a life that truly belonged to us. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Violet Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.